Buffalo, Wyoming. The town sat in the shadow of the Bighorn Mountains, the way a smaller thing sits in the shadow of a larger one. Without complaint, simply arranged that way by geography and time. Adelaide Freeman stepped off the train into air that smelled of dust and pine and something else she couldn't name yet. Something dry and clean that St. Louis air never had. She was 24 years old. She had a trunk, a leather satchel, and a folded deed she had not looked at since the lawyer in Columbus placed it in her hands. She had told herself the trip would take 2 weeks. She had already decided before she'd even boarded the train exactly how this would go. 2 weeks to walk the property with whatever lawyer or land agent the town could produce, 2 weeks to sign whatever papers needed signing, and then the eastbound train, again back to the bookkeeping position, waiting for her at a shipping firm on the river, back to the ordinary shape of a life she'd spent the last year rebuilding out of the pieces left after a broken engagement, had reminded her exactly how little her family's troubles were worth to some people. She was good at rebuilding. She had gotten efficient at it the way a person gets efficient at anything they're forced to practice too many times. Her father had died in March. He had never once mentioned Wyoming, not in 24 years of dinners and holidays and ordinary Tuesdays, and then a lawyer's letter arrived, describing 60 acres along a creek at the northern edge of a town she'd never heard of. Adelaide had sat with that letter longer than she'd sat with anything in years. Grief did strange things to a person's sense of what they knew. She had thought she knew her father completely. She was starting to understand that a person could love someone their whole life and still be handed a folder of secrets after they were gone. Among his effects, she had found almost nothing that explained it, no correspondence, no old letters bearing a Wyoming postmark. Only a single tintype photograph tucked in the back of a drawer, faded and unlabeled, showing a stretch of open land she hadn't recognized until the lawyer's letter gave it a name. She found the boarding house easily enough, Hale House, a wide porch, and a sign that needed repainting, but she did not go there first. She walked. She told herself she was stretching her legs after 3 days on a train, and that was true, but it was also true that she wanted to see the land before anyone could tell her what to think about it. She got lost within 20 minutes. The road split without warning, and the split unsplit into something that wasn't quite a road at all, just wheel ruts through grass, gone gold with early summer. She kept walking anyway, because turning back felt like admitting something, and that was when she saw the fence line and the man working it. I was pulling wire taut between 2 posts, sleeves rolled to the elbow, hat pushed back enough that she could see his face before he saw her. He worked like a man who had done this 10,000 times and still paid attention to each staple he drove. "Morning," he said, without turning around. At first, the way people who live alongside land learn to sense another person before they see them. Then he did turn and stopped. She asked if this was the road to town. It was not, he told her, not exactly. Town was a half-mile east. She'd want to follow the fence line down. He said it plainly, no more words than the question required. But he looked at her longer than the directions needed, and she looked back before she caught herself doing it. And something in that half-second stretched longer than either of them meant it to. She thanked him and turned to go. He said nothing else. She walked the fence line east, aware in a way she didn't like of the fact that she could still feel exactly where he was standing behind her, though she never looked back to check. The gloves. She noticed them only once she was out of sight, worn leather gloves he'd set down on a post rail while he worked, cracked at the knuckles from years of the same motion. An odd thing to remember about a stranger. She kept remembering it anyway. At Hale House, she gave her name to a woman with sharp eyes and a soft voice. Constance Hale, who took one look at the state of her dress and said she'd clearly come the long way round. Adelaide didn't correct her about how long. She unpacked her trunk in a small room that smelled of cedar, set the folded deed on the nightstand, without opening it, and told herself again that this would take 2 weeks. She lay awake that night, longer than she expected to, thinking about creek water she hadn't yet seen and a man whose name she hadn't asked for. In the morning, she planned to find out who owned the land north of her father's 60 acres. She told herself it was only practical a person should know her neighbors before she sells to strangers. She did not examine that reasoning any further than that, because she suspected even now that it wouldn't hold up if she did. Downstairs, over breakfast, she asked Constance Hale, one question as casually as she could manage. Who was the man working the fence line at the northern edge of the Freeman land? Constance set down the coffee pot and looked at her the particular way a woman looks at another woman who has just asked a question she already knows the real answer to. "That'll be Eli Whitfield," she said. "His ranch backs right up against yours." Adelaide said only that she'd wanted to know for practical reasons, and Constance said nothing further, only smiled the smile of a woman who has decided not to say what she's thinking, at least not yet. Constance Hale ran Hale House, the way she ran most things, with an economy of movement that made the work look easier than it was. She had buried a husband, raised 2 sons who'd gone west to Montana, and wrote infrequently and settled into the version of herself that noticed everything and said only some of it. She had also, Adelaide was quickly learning opinions about nearly every family within 20 miles, delivered in the same even tone she used for the weather, so that a guest could sit through an entire meal being informed of a neighbor's business without ever quite realizing a story was being told. "You'll want to know the Fergusons keep to themselves, and the Hendricks girl is engaged to a man from Sheridan nobody much likes," Constance said on the first evening, apropos of nothing Adelaide had asked, "and that the Whitfield place backs onto your father's land, in case that matters to you." She said the last part with no more weight than the rest, and Adelaide, tired from the road, hadn't yet learned to hear the weight underneath Constance Hale's flat delivery. On the second evening, over a plate of stewed chicken and dumplings, Constance mentioned that the Whitfield place had been dry 2 summers running, same as half the ranches strung along the northern edge of town, and that if fall came without rain, there'd be hard decisions ahead for a lot of families. She said it the way you mention weather, not as gossip aimed anywhere in particular, but Adelaide noticed her own hand go still around her fork. "Is that the same water that runs through my father's land?" she asked. "The Freeman Creek's the only one still running proper this time of year," Constance said. "Has been for longer than I can say. Whitfield's cattle drink from it. So does half the North Pasture crowd one way or another." She looked up and realized from Adelaide's face that she hadn't known at all. "Your father never mentioned it," Constance said, not quite a question. "My father never mentioned Wyoming at all, until a lawyer wrote to tell me he owned a piece of it." Constance considered this with the particular stillness of a woman recalculating everything she thought she understood about a guest. "Well," she said finally, "he was a careful man about some things. Kept his own counsel about the land, same as he kept his own counsel about most everything else far as I ever saw him." Adelaide didn't ask more questions that night. She sat with the fact instead, turning it over the way she'd turn over a coin to check both sides. Her father's land wasn't only a curious inheritance sitting quietly at the edge of a town she'd never see again. It was apparently load-bearing for people she hadn't met. She thought of the man at the fence line. She thought of his gloves. She thought, too, about how strange it was to sit at a stranger's table in a town she'd never planned to visit, being told second-hand facts about her own father that she should, by any reasonable measure, have already known. It made her wonder what else about him she'd never troubled to ask. The following afternoon, working at the small writing desk in her room, with the deed finally unfolded in front of her, she heard a knock at the front door 2 floors below. She didn't think anything of it until Constance called up the stairs that she had a visitor. It was Eli Whitfield, standing on the porch, with a shovel in his hand, that belonged apparently to Hale House, borrowed some weeks back, and now being returned. It was, Adelaide understood immediately, the thinnest excuse a person could invent for showing up somewhere. Constance clearly understood it too, judging by the particular blankness she arranged on her face before retreating to the kitchen with unusual haste. "You found your way to town then," Eli said. It wasn't quite a question. "I did. Your directions held up." He nodded, then stood there a moment, as if he'd rehearsed getting this far and hadn't planned much beyond it. "I heard about your father," he said finally. "He came through here a handful of times years back. Kept mostly to himself. Good man from what I saw of him." This landed harder than she expected. Her father had stood somewhere near this porch once, twice, some handful of times she'd never know the count of, and had never once mentioned any of it at the dinner table in Columbus. "I didn't know he'd been here at all until the lawyer's letter came," she admitted. That's so. Strange thing," Eli said, "a man keeping a piece of ground quiet his whole life. Must have meant something to him to hold on to it that long, without ever building on it or selling it off." He said it thoughtfully, not as a question, but Adelaide heard the question underneath it anyway. "What will you do with it now?" "I haven't decided," she said, which was true if incomplete. "Didn't ask," he said, and there was the faintest edge of dry humor in it, the first she'd heard from him. He looked at her a moment longer, then picked his hat back up off the rail, where he'd set it, without her noticing, and said he ought to get back before dark. "Thank you for the shovel," she said. "Wasn't really about the shovel," he said. And for 1/2 second, something like a smile started somewhere behind his eyes, before he caught it, turned, and walked down the porch steps toward his horse. Constance reappeared from the kitchen, holding a dish towel she didn't need. "Man doesn't usually come all the way into town for a shovel," she said. "I gathered that," Adelaide said, and went back upstairs before Constance could see whatever her face was doing. Silas Doyle arrived on the Thursday stage in a suit too clean for Buffalo's dust, carrying a leather case and the particular confidence of a man who has never once doubted his own timing. He introduced himself in the parlor of Hale House with a handshake, a half-second too long, and a smile that had clearly served him well in rooms far grander than this one. How was Adelaide guessed within the first 5 minutes, a man who had learned early that charm could substitute for most anything else a negotiation required, and who had never since found reason to doubt the lesson. He admired the parlor's furnishings. He asked after her journey west with what sounded like genuine interest, though she suspected he asked the same question in the same tone of every widow and heir and unwitting landholder he called on. He mentioned in passing 3 other successful purchases the company had closed that spring alone, as though the number itself were meant to reassure her. He represented the Cheyenne Land and Cattle Company, which had taken an interest in the Freeman parcel on account of its water frontage. He named a figure generous, more than enough to clear the small debts her father's estate hadn't quite covered, and comfortable besides. Adelaide did the arithmetic in her head before he'd finished speaking, the old habit from her bookkeeping training asserting itself even here. The figure would cover her father's remaining creditors twice over. It would let her return to Columbus with enough set aside that she needn't take up steady work at all. If she chose not to, needn't answer to anyone's schedule but her own for the better part of a year. It was by any practical measure the sensible answer to a question she hadn't asked to be given in the first place. "The offer stands 3 weeks," Doyle said, folding his hands. "After that, the company's attention moves elsewhere. Land like this doesn't sit unclaimed for long, Miss Freeman, and I'd hate to see you lose out on account of hesitation. Grief makes people slow to decide. I understand that, but the market doesn't wait on grief." There was something in the way he said it, practiced and smooth, that made Adelaide's instinct tighten even as her arithmetic kept insisting the offer was sound. She had spent enough of the last year being managed by people who believed they understood her interests better than she did to recognize the shape of it now dressed up as concern. "This is my third territory this year, Miss Freeman," Doyle added almost as an aside, the practiced warmth slipping for just a moment into something plainer and more tired. "Company doesn't take kindly to agents who come back from a posting empty-handed. I'd consider it a personal favor if you'd give this the serious weight it deserves." It was the truest thing he said the whole visit, and Adelaide filed it away without knowing yet what use it would be. Adelaide said she'd need time to consider it properly. Doyle said, of course, take whatever time she needed within the 3 weeks, which was its own kind of pressure, dressed up as patience. He left his card. He left the papers. He left the particular unease of a decision now wearing a deadline. She was still sitting with the papers spread in front of her an hour later, past the point of reading them, and well into the point of simply looking at the number circled in Doyle's neat hand, when she heard a horse outside and looked up to see Eli dismounting at the hitching post. The timing struck her as too precise to be accidental, and later she'd learned she was right. Word moved fast in a town of this size, and Doyle's arrival at Hale House had reached the Whitfield Ranch by way of the general store before the stage had even finished unloading. He didn't come to the door right away. He stood by the post a moment, watching the stage pull away down the road, his jaw set in a way she hadn't seen before. When he finally climbed the porch steps, Adelaide had already stepped outside, drawn by something she couldn't quite name. "That the man from Cheyenne," Eli said. "You've heard of him. Everyone this side of the mountains has heard of him." He said it without heat, but there was something underneath the flatness of it, something held carefully in check. "Company's been buying up water frontage since spring, fencing it off once they get it. Selling grazing rights back to whoever can pay, which mostly isn't the folks who used to use it free." Something cold moved through her. He didn't mention any of that. He wouldn't. What happens to the families who can't pay? They sell off what stock they can't water. Move on, most of them, if they've got somewhere to move to. Some don't. He said this the way he said everything, without embellishment. But she could hear the weight of names behind the plain words, families he likely knew by their first names and their children's ages. She asked the question plainly, because plain seemed to be the only language that worked here. "You're worried I'll sell?" Eli was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. When he didn't look at her directly, looking instead toward the darkening line of the mountains behind the house, as though the words came easier that way. "I'm worried about a lot of things," he said. "That's only one of them." He didn't explain the rest. He touched the brim of his hat, said he ought to get back before full dark, and was on his horse and gone before Adelaide had gathered enough of herself to ask what the other things were. She stood on the porch a long while after the sound of hooves had faded, turning his sentence over the way she'd turned over the coin of the creek water 2 nights before. Except this coin didn't have 2 clear sides. It had a dozen, and she couldn't get a fair look at any of them. Inside, Doyle's papers still sat on the parlor table, the circled number catching the last of the evening light through the window. 3 weeks. It had sounded that morning like a reasonable and even generous span of time to make a sound decision about a piece of land she'd never asked for and hadn't planned to keep. It did not feel that way anymore. She gathered Doyle's papers, folded them along their original creases, and put them away in the trunk instead of the desk. Not a decision, just a delay. She told herself that was all it was. Eli came back on Saturday to finish the stretch of fence he'd started the week Adelaide arrived, the same section that had first pointed her toward town. She saw him from the window while she was meant to be answering correspondence about her father's remaining debts, and found she couldn't keep her attention on the letters for more than a few minutes at a stretch. She told herself, gathering the coffee pot and 2 cups, that it was simple neighborliness, the kind any reasonable person would extend to a man working alone on a warm morning. She was aware, even as she told herself this, that neighborliness didn't usually require quite this much deliberation over which cup to bring. She brought coffee out to him without entirely deciding to. It seemed in the moment like the only sensible response to a man working alone in the sun on land that was on paper hers. He thanked her and drank it, standing one hand still holding the fence wire taut, and when he set the cup down on a post rail, he asked without much preamble whether she intended to help or just to watch. "I don't know the first thing about fence work," she said. "Didn't ask if you knew it. Asked if you intended to help." She laughed before she meant to, a short surprised sound, and found herself holding the wire where he showed her gloved hands, his spare pair too big for her cuffed, twice at the wrist, gripping the strand while he drove the staple home. Their hands were close enough on the wire that when he reached to adjust her grip, correcting the angle, his fingers closed briefly over hers, and neither of them moved for the half-second longer than the correction required. "Like that," he said quiet and let go. They worked the rest of the line that way, a rhythm settling between them that had nothing to do with words. She held. He drove the staples. Somewhere in the second hour, she stopped thinking about the deed folded in her trunk, or the number Doyle had circled, and thought instead about the particular satisfaction of watching a fence get straighter one post at a time, and about a man who worked with a patience that made her own city-bred hurry look in retrospect like a kind of exhaustion she hadn't noticed she was carrying. "How long have you had this place?" she asked, mostly to fill the quiet, though she found she was genuinely curious. "Bought the first 100 acres when I was 25. Added to it since when the money allowed." He tested the wire's tension with 2 fingers, satisfied, moved to the next post. 20 years near enough, same piece of ground. Doesn't sound like much said out loud. It sounds like a great deal, actually. He glanced at her something, considering in his expression, as though weighing whether she meant it or was simply being polite. Most folks who ask that question are wondering why a man my age never left for somewhere bigger, he said. Cheyenne, Denver, somewhere with more to it than cattle and weather. I wasn't wondering that. No, he said after a moment, like he'd checked and found it to be true. I don't believe you were. You do everything this slow, she asked at one point, mostly to hear what he'd say. I do everything once, he said. Don't have to redo work that's done right the first time. A pause, the faintest edge of dry humor surfacing. Faster in the long run than your way, I expect. My way, rushing at it. Deciding quick so the deciding's over with. He didn't look at her when he said it, kept his eyes on the wire. But she understood he wasn't only talking about fences, and from the small stillness that followed, she suspected he understood that she understood. She didn't argue the point mostly because she couldn't not, honestly. She had rushed at plenty in her life. The decision to leave Ohio quickly once the engagement ended, the decision to come here, meaning only to sign papers, and leave again, the decision, 3 days ago, to walk out toward a fence line. She had no real reason to be curious about. Rushing had never once made the hard parts hurt less. It had only made her feel afterward like she'd skipped past something she should have sat with longer. You've gone quiet, Eli said, glancing over. I'm thinking. About the fence. No, she admitted, and left it there. And he didn't push, only nodded once and let the silence hold whatever she wasn't ready to say. By late afternoon, the fence was done straight and taut the length of the property line, and Adelaide had a streak of dried mud along the hem of her skirt that she made no move to brush away. Eli coiled the last of the spare wire, looked at the finished line with the satisfaction of a man surveying honest work, then looked at her. You did better than most first-timers, he said. High praise. I don't give it where it isn't earned. He said this simply, no performance in it at all, and somehow that made it land harder than flattery would have. He gathered his tools, and there was a moment brief where neither of them moved to end the afternoon, both of them standing at a finished fence with no more practical reason to stay and staying anyway. It was Eli who finally settling his hat back on and thanking her for the coffee. The help the afternoon in that order, as though naming each thing kept it contained to something smaller than what it had actually been. She watched him ride north same as before, and this time she didn't pretend to herself that she wasn't watching. The mud stayed on her skirt through supper. Constance noticed it, and noticed the particular quiet Adelaide carried through the meal, and said nothing at all, which was its own kind of comment. The blacksmith's shop sat at the center of Buffalo, the way such things did in towns this size, a gathering point disguised as a business. And it was there, waiting while a wheel rim was reset on the Hale House wagon, that Adelaide finally saw the old water map Constance had mentioned in passing days before. It hung behind the counter, yellowed and creased at its folds, marking every creek and spring within 20 miles in a hand that had clearly redrawn it more than once over the years as sources dried and others opened. The blacksmith, a broad, quiet man named Tobias Reed, followed her gaze and explained without much prompting. The Freeman Creek, he called it that, without hesitation, as though the name had simply attached itself to the land. Regardless of who currently held the deed, was the only reliable year-round source left on the north side of town. Everything else ran seasonal or had gone dry these past 2 summers, with the weather turning meaner than anyone could remember. Whitfield's herd depends on it, Tobias said. So does Callahan's place and the Ferris family and near enough a dozen smaller outfits strung along that stretch. Been that way longer than I've had this shop. How long has that been? 22 years. He said it without needing to think, the way a man states a fact he's measured his whole life against. Watched 3 droughts in that time. This one's shaping up meaner than the last 2 put together, if the old-timers are right about how the winter's likely to run. Adelaide asked as evenly as she could manage what would happen if that water were fenced off from common use. Tobias looked at her, the way a man looks at someone who has just asked a question with an answer too large and too obvious to need saying. Then said it anyway, plainly because she'd asked. Ranches would sell off stock they couldn't water. Some families would leave outright. The town itself, small as it was, drew off the same watershed further down. It wouldn't happen overnight, he said, but it would happen the way any slow disaster happens, a little at a time, until one day everyone looks around and realizes the thing they depended on is simply gone. Your father knew all this, I expect, Tobias added, not unkindly. Man who owns the only good water for miles generally comes to understand what it means sooner or later, whether he wants to or not. Adelaide thought of the tintype photograph in her father's drawer, the unlabeled stretch of land she hadn't recognized until a lawyer's letter gave it a name. She wondered, walking back to the wagon, what her father had understood about this place that he'd never once thought to tell her. She thanked Tobias and walked back to Hale House with the wagon repaired and her understanding of her father's land entirely rearranged. It wasn't only Eli's cattle at stake, or even the handful of ranches Tobias had named. It was closer to the whole northern half of a town's worth of people depending, without knowing it, depended on a decision she alone had the legal right to make. That evening, she walked out to the Whitfield ranch instead of waiting for Eli to come to her, which was its own small admission she didn't examine too closely. She found him on the porch of a house that matched him exactly, plain, well-built, nothing wasted, everything mended before it broke rather than after. He didn't seem surprised to see her, only rose and offered her the second chair, without a word, as though he'd been expecting this particular visit for longer than she had. I talked to Tobias Reed today, she said once she'd sat. Figured you would eventually. You could have told me yourself. That first day even, instead of letting me find out from the blacksmith. I was quiet a moment, looking out at the mountains, going the particular purple they went at this hour, a color she'd started noticing the way she noticed few things back in Ohio. Didn't want you deciding on account of what I need, he said finally. Wanted you deciding on account of what's true. Seemed like there was a difference worth keeping. It was, she thought, one of the more careful things anyone had ever said to her, careful in a way that had nothing to do with caution and everything to do with respect, respect for the fact that she was capable of weighing a hard truth honestly, if only someone gave her the truth to weigh instead of managing her toward a conclusion. That's a fine distinction to hold on to while 3 weeks run out, she said not unkindly. I know it. He didn't offer anything more, didn't press his case, didn't so much as glance toward the creek she knew ran somewhere behind his barn, dark and quiet now in the fading light. He simply sat and let the silence between them do the work that words might have ruined. Doesn't it frighten you? She asked, waiting on a decision that isn't yours to make. Plenty, he admitted, but fear's a poor reason to push somebody toward an answer. Seen men do worse than lose water on account of pushing too hard for what they wanted. I'd rather lose the creek honestly than keep it by talking you into something you didn't choose clean. She found to her own surprise that she didn't mind the silence that followed at all. She'd spent her whole life around people who filled every quiet moment with something. Opinions, plans, reassurances she hadn't asked for. Here was a man who let a silence be exactly as large as it needed to be, and somehow that felt more honest than anything Doyle had said with his careful, well-practiced words. She stayed longer than she'd intended, the two of them watching the same darkening sky, and when she finally rose to walk back to town, he offered to see her part way, and she let him, and neither of them said much of anything, the whole quiet walk back, and neither of them needed to. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, forwarded from her old address in Columbus, through 2 other addresses before finally catching up to her at Hale House, and Adelaide recognized the handwriting on the envelope, before she'd even fully registered picking it up from the tray by the door. She carried it upstairs, unopened, and sat with it a long while before she found the nerve or perhaps the resignation to break the seal. It was from Margaret Ellsworth, once a close friend, now the sort of acquaintance who wrote only when there was news that couldn't wait to be delivered in person. The news delivered in Margaret's careful, well-meaning hand was that Charles Bellamy, her Charles once for the better part of 2 years, until his family's opinion of the Freeman finances shifted, the ground beneath the engagement, was to be married in the fall to a young woman from a family in good standing, with no complications attached to their name. Margaret's letter went on for 2 full pages, describing the bride's family, the wedding plans already underway, a detail about the church that had been chosen. All of it delivered with the particular thoroughness of someone who believed more information was always the kinder gift, when sometimes the kindest thing would have been fewer words and a shorter letter. Margaret had meant it kindly. Adelaide understood that even through the sting of it. She'd meant it as the sort of information a friend owes another friend, so she wouldn't hear it secondhand and be blindsided. But kindness didn't change what the letter did to the rest of the afternoon, which was to unearth cleanly and completely every feeling Adelaide had spent a year and a half trying to bury under practicality and distance. She had told herself back in Columbus that she understood Charles's reasoning, even if she couldn't forgive it. His family had built their standing carefully over 2 generations, and a fiancé whose father's debts had become suddenly and publicly known was not a complication they were willing to absorb. He had not fought for her. That was the part that stayed lodged somewhere under her ribs longer than the rejection itself, not that his family objected, but that when they did, he had simply agreed with them quietly, without a single word spent in her defense. She had built her whole approach to life since then around a simple, protective principle: trust what is written down, what is certain, what cannot change its mind the way a person can. A deed, a contract, a number circled neatly on a page. These things did not require anyone to choose you and could not later unchoose you. It was, she now understood, sitting with Margaret's letter in her lap, the same principle steering her steadily toward Doyle's offer, and away from every uncertain, unwritten thing this town had shown her. She thought of Eli's hand closing briefly over hers on the fence wire. She thought of 2 chairs on a porch and a silence that asked nothing of her. Those things were not written down anywhere. They could not be filed or notarized or relied upon the way a signed contract could. That she told herself was precisely the danger of them. She did not go down to supper that evening. Constance, with the particular tact of a woman who had raised sons and buried a husband, left a plate outside her door without comment. It was nearly dark when she heard a knock softer than Constance's usual rap, and opened the door to find Eli standing in the hallway, with his hat in his hands, looking like a man who had talked himself in and out of coming at least twice before finally arriving. "Constance sent word you weren't well," he said. "Didn't mean to intrude. She should have said she was fine. She had said it to everyone else all day." Instead, standing in the doorway, with Margaret's letter still creased in her hand, she found she couldn't quite manage the lie, and something in her face must have told him as much, because he didn't press for an explanation. He simply asked if she wanted company or wanted quiet and let her choose. She chose the porch, and he sat beside her on the top step without asking why. And for a long while, neither of them said anything at all. Eventually, because the silence had become its own kind of invitation, she told him plainly. The way he told things, no more words than the truth required about Charles, about the engagement, about the particular quiet way it had ended. Eli listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he was quiet a moment longer, looking out at the dark street rather than at her, the way he seemed to look elsewhere whenever he was about to say something that mattered. "Man had the chance to stand next to you when it cost him something," he said finally, "and he chose not to pay it. That's not a mark against you. That's just the whole truth of who he was showing itself at the one moment it mattered." He turned to look at her then. "You didn't lose much losing that." It wasn't comfort exactly, not the soft kind she'd braced for. It was something sturdier, a fact laid plainly in front of her, the way he laid every fact in front of her, and she found it did more good than any comfort could have. She looked at him for a long moment in the porch light, and something in her chest that had been clenched since Margaret's letter arrived loosened just slightly, just enough to notice. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once the way he nodded at the end of most things, and stayed on the step beside her until well after full dark, saying nothing further, needing to say nothing further. And Adelaide found that of everything anyone had said to her that whole difficult day, his silence was the thing she'd remember longest. Branding day at the Whitfield Ranch arrived with the kind of noise a quiet place makes only once or twice a season. Neighboring ranch hands and their families gathered before sunrise. The lowing of cattle penned for the work ahead, the smell of wood smoke and hot iron cutting through the cool morning air. Constance had volunteered Hale House's kitchen for the effort. Weeks earlier, an arrangement so routine among the ranches that no one thought to ask permission, only to divide the labor, and Adelaide found herself pressed into service alongside 3 other women from town, cutting bread and stirring beans in a kitchen, too small for the crowd it was meant to feed. She had told herself she'd stay near the kitchen the whole day. She lasted until mid-morning. It was the sound of laughter from the corral that finally pulled her outside, and once outside she found she couldn't make herself go back in, not with Eli visible across the yard, moving among his hands and his neighbors with an easy authority that looked nothing like the quiet, careful man she'd come to know on porches and fence lines. Here he was, decisive, quick, trusted without question by men twice his age, calling out instructions and taking his own turn at the iron without hesitation, and something about watching him work a job he clearly loved, surrounded by people who clearly respected him, rearranged something in how she saw him. One of the other women, a weathered rancher's wife named Sarah Callahan, came to stand beside her at the fence rail and followed her gaze without comment. for a moment before saying, mild as anything. He's a good one, that Whitfield. Rare out here a man who works that hard and still remembers to say thank you to the people helping him do it. She glanced sideways at Adelaide. Rarer still one who hasn't married yet at his age. Folks wonder about it. Adelaide said only that she hadn't wondered, which was by this point no longer entirely true, and Sarah Callahan smiled the particular smile of a woman who had heard that exact kind of denial many times before and believed none of it. He caught sight of her at the fence rail sometime past noon and crossed the yard, had pushed back, sleeves rolled to the elbow, dust across one cheek he hadn't noticed. He asked if she'd ever been on a horse. She admitted she had not really, a few slow turns around a paddock as a girl and nothing since. Come on then, he said, and led her to a mare standing calm at the edge of the corral, gentler than the working stock, clearly chosen for exactly this purpose. He held the mare steady and offered his hands to help her up, and when she put her boot in the and reached for the saddle horn, his hands came to her waist to steady her, the last of the way, and stayed there a beat longer than the mounting strictly required, long enough that she felt the warmth of it clear through her dress, long enough that when she settled in the saddle and looked down at him, neither of them moved to break the moment first. There, he said, quieter than the yard around them. You've got it. She rode, a slow, easy circuit at his side. The mare well behaved beneath her, and for a stretch of minutes the noise of the branding fires and the shouting hands and the whole busy yard fell away into something almost private, just the two of them and the sound of hooves in dry grass. You're a natural, he said, watching her hands on the reins. You're being kind. I told you before. I don't give it where it isn't earned. He glanced over, something warmer in his expression than she'd seen from him even on the quietest of their porch evenings. You're doing fine. It was on the walk back to the corral fence leading the mare together that she finally asked about the pale scar along the back of his left hand, one she'd noticed before and never asked about. I was quiet long enough that she thought he might simply not answer, the way he sometimes let a question pass unanswered when it touched something he hadn't decided to share. Then he told her. 3 winters back, a bad storm had caught him and his younger brother Daniel out checking the herd further from the house than either of them should have risked. They'd argued that morning, something small, forgotten now, except for the fact that it had happened. Daniel had ridden ahead, angry. The storm came down harder and faster than either of them expected. Eli had found him 2 days later, and not in time. He told it plainly, without asking for anything from her in the telling. No plea for sympathy. In his voice only, the flat weight of a fact he'd carried a long time, and finally said out loud to someone who hadn't already heard it from someone else first. I don't tell people that, he said when he'd finished. Not usually. Why me? He considered the question honestly, the way he considered most things. Don't rightly know, he said. Seemed like you'd want the truth of me instead of the parts I let show easy. A pause. Seemed like you'd earned that somewhere along the way. She didn't have an answer equal to that, so she didn't try to manufacture one. She simply stayed beside him, the mare between them, until the sun began sliding down toward the mountains, and the branding fires burned low, and the day's noise softened into the particular quiet of an evening winding down. They stood together at the corral fence as the color changed over the bighorn's shoulder, near enough to shoulder that neither of them moved to widen the gap, and Adelaide understood, watching that light change, that whatever she'd told herself about staying 2 weeks and settling her father's affairs and returning quietly to Ohio, some of that certainty had quietly come undone somewhere over the course of this one long day. Doyle came back into town 9 days before his 3 weeks were up, not to see Adelaide directly this time, but to make himself visible at the general store, at the church social that Sunday, wherever Buffalo's gossip naturally pooled. Adelaide would later understand better at this part of his work than he'd let on during his first polished visit. The part that didn't involve contracts at all, only well-placed words dropped in the right ears. It was Sarah Callahan who told her gently, and with visible discomfort, standing at the dry goods counter while Adelaide waited on a length of ribbon. "I don't put much stock in it," Sarah said, first the way people always preface the thing they're about to repeat anyway. "But that landman's been saying around town that Eli Whitfield's been courting you on purpose. Said it plain to my husband, that Whitfield's too smart a rancher not to know exactly what he stood to lose if you sold, and too proud to just ask you outright, so he's been working it the slow way instead. Said you'd want to know folks are talking." Adelaide felt something cold and horribly familiar move through her, the particular chill of watching a story about her own life being told by someone else. A story that fit her old wound so precisely, she wondered for one terrible half-second whether it might be true. She told herself Doyle was simply doing what he'd told her plainly enough he would, protecting the company's interest by whatever means available. She told herself she knew Eli knew the shape of his silences, knew he wasn't a man who calculated anything the way Doyle was suggesting. She told herself all of this on the walk back to Hale House, and by the time she arrived, she had almost convinced herself. Then Constance, without meaning any harm, mentioned that Eli had come by that morning, while Adelaide was out, and had seemed, in Constance's word, troubled. He'd left no message. He'd simply asked if Adelaide was well, and left again almost as soon as he'd arrived, and Constance, watching Adelaide's face change at the retelling, understood too late that she'd said something she shouldn't have. Adelaide walked out to the Whitfield ranch that evening, for the second time uninvited, though this visit carried none of the nervous hope of the first. She found Eli on the porch, and something in his posture told her he already knew what had reached her, or knew enough to guess. "I heard what Doyle's been saying," she said, without preamble, standing at the bottom of the porch steps rather than climbing them. "I want you to tell me it isn't true. I want you to tell me plainly the way you tell me everything else." This was the moment she would understand much later that mattered more than any other in the whole account of them, not because of what he said, but because of what he didn't. Eli went still, in the particular way he went still when a question touched something he hadn't prepared himself to answer. He knew she could see him knowing exactly what the honest answer required, that yes, the water mattered to him more than he'd ever fully admitted, that he had known from the very first Thursday exactly what her decision could cost him, and that none of that changed one single thing about why he'd kept coming back to a fence line long after the fence was mended. But some old caution in him, the same caution that had kept him silent about the creek for weeks, curdled now into something else entirely. Something closer to wounded pride. And instead of saying any of it, he said only flat and closed, "Believe whatever you've already decided to believe." It was the wrong answer. It was, she understood, even as he said it, likely the only answer his pride would allow him in that moment. But it landed like a door closing, and she stood at the bottom of his porch steps with the particular ache of having asked for honesty and received silence. Instead, the exact silence, in fact, that she'd once found so trustworthy now turned against her at the one moment she needed it broken. "That's not an answer," she said quietly. "It's the only one I've got tonight," he said, and neither of them moved for a long moment. And then Adelaide turned and walked back toward town in the dark. And Eli did not follow her, and later he would understand that not following her was the second mistake, coming so close behind the first that he'd barely had time to feel the weight of one before adding the other. She did not sleep well that night. She lay in the small, cedar-scented room, turning over every gentle thing Eli had ever said to her, testing each one now against Doyle's version of events. The way a person tests a coin they suspect might be counterfeit, turning it in the light, listening for the wrong sound. Every kindness could, if she let it be reread as strategy. The coffee brought without asking. The mayor offered at branding day. Even the story of his brother told so carefully, so seemingly without agenda. Even that, in the small hours of the night, she found herself questioning and hated herself a little for questioning it, and questioned it anyway. In the morning, Constance found her at the kitchen table before sunrise, not eating, only sitting with her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold. Constance uncharacteristically did not offer an opinion on the matter of Eli Whitfield. She only sat down across from Adelaide and said, "A man can be worth trusting and still say the wrong thing when he's frightened. Doesn't make the trusting foolish, just makes the frightening real." It was the closest thing to advice Constance had given all summer, and Adelaide turned it over for the rest of the day without deciding what to do with it. She did not go out to the Whitfield ranch again that week. Nor did Eli come to town. The distance between them, which had closed so steadily over the past month, opened again, with a speed that frightened her more than she wanted to admit, and Doyle's contract still folded in her trunk no longer felt quite so easy to dismiss. The drought announced itself before anyone official did. The creek that ran through what everyone in town still called the Freeman land, shrinking day by day into a thin, uncertain thread between banks that showed cracked mud where water should have stood. It arrived, as these things often do, at the worst possible time, the same week Adelaide and Eli had gone from seeing each other daily to not at all. It was Tobias Reed who forced the reckoning. He came to Hale House on a Tuesday morning to say plainly that the North Pasture ranchers needed to meet about water sharing before the week was out, and that Eli Whitfield, stubborn as he was about most things, had been putting off calling the meeting himself for reasons Tobias didn't fully understand and didn't much care to. "Man's got no business protecting his pride when there's cattle at stake," Tobias said. "Would you tell him that Miss Freeman, seeing as you two seem to have stopped speaking, for some reason nobody in this town can quite explain?" She went, telling herself it was for the ranchers, whose names she'd learned that spring, whose water this now also was, and not at all for Eli's sake. She found him alone at the barn, staring at a chalked board he hadn't finished filling in. He looked up when she entered, and whatever guard he'd been holding all week seemed to slip just slightly at the sight of her. "Tobias sent me," she said. "Says you've been putting off the meeting." "Have been," he admitted. "Why?" He set down the chalk. "Adelaide," he said, and stopped there like a man who'd used up his courage just getting that far. Then he found more. "Because I said the wrong thing to you, and I've been too proud all week to come say the right one," he said. "I've spent my whole life being careful with words, so I wouldn't have to feel foolish saying too much. Never once thought about what that carefulness could cost, said at the wrong moment, to the wrong person." He looked at her directly, none of his usual caution in it. "Doyle wasn't wrong that the water matters to me. Matters more than I've ever let on, maybe more than I let myself understand, until I thought I might lose you over it. But he was dead wrong about the rest, and I let my pride answer you instead of the truth, and I am sorry for that, plainly, the way I should have been sorry that same night, instead of waiting a week to say it." It was, Adelaide thought, the most words she had ever heard him say at once, and every one of them plain, unhedged, exactly the kind of honesty she had asked for on his porch steps and not received. "I let Doyle's version sit in my head longer than I should have, too," she admitted. "Some old part of me still expects the people I care about to disappoint me the way I've been disappointed before. That's not fair to you. I should have trusted what I already knew about you instead of what a stranger told me. Maybe we were both a little foolish. Maybe," she said, and something between them eased, not fully, not all at once, but enough. That evening, the barn filled with lanterns hung along the beams. ranchers and their sons standing shoulder to shoulder in the dusty light. And Adelaide watched Eli lay out his plan on the chalked board. He'd finally finished equal shares for every outfit. Cattle counted honestly, no exceptions, made for size or standing. Walt Ferris grumbled about his own larger herd going shorter under the plan. "Then it goes shorter," Eli said. "Same as everybody's. Started with 100 acres and nothing else myself. And I remember who helped me through my own dry years. This is me paying part of it back." The room settled after that with considerably less argument, and Adelaide watched him give away advantage that was legally his to keep in the middle of a week that had already cost him something private besides, and understood more fully than any porch conversation could have taught her exactly why she'd been right to trust him in the first place. In the days that followed, she found herself out at the creek most mornings, hauling buckets and checking the marked stakes that measured the water's slow retreat, while Eli moved between ranches, seeing the rotation. Held fair, coming home each evening, sunburned and quiet, with the exhaustion of a man carrying more than his share of a whole community's worry. She found him at the creek's edge one evening, sitting on the dry bank, looking at what little water remained his hands, resting loose across his knees, in a posture of pure depletion. She sat down beside him, without asking the way he'd once sat beside her on her own porch step. "You gave up more than your share today," she said. "Same as every day this week. Wasn't giving up anything that was ever really mine to keep for myself," he said. "Your father understood that. Never fenced this creek off from anyone all the years he owned it. I wish I'd known him the way this town seems to have known him," Adelaide said quietly. "I keep learning new pieces of who he was out here." "Keep them then," Eli said. "Nothing wrong with a person turning out larger than the version of them you grew up with." "I'm not going to sign with Doyle," she said. "I decided that days ago. I should have told you sooner." Something eased visibly in him. Tension she hadn't fully registered until it left his shoulders. He nodded once the way he nodded at the end of things that mattered, and looked back out at the thin creek. "Wasn't asking you to decide it for my sake," he said quietly. "I know that. That's exactly why I could." He looked at her, then really looked. The porch-light attention she'd grown used to, sharpened now into something with no caution left in it at all. And in the fading evening light, sitting together on the dry creek bank, with dust on both their hands. From a long shared day of honest work, their shoulders came to rest against each other, and this time neither of them shifted away, and neither of them pretended it was an accident. Doyle returned on the appointed day, at the end of the third week, precisely on schedule, his suit as clean as it had been the first time, his manner carrying the same confident patience of a man who expected the outcome to go his way because it usually did. He laid the contract across the same parlor table at Hale House, the same number circled in the same neat hand, and asked with the faint condescension of a man who considered the answer a formality whether Miss Freeman was prepared to sign. She was prepared, she told him, but not to sign that. She had drawn up with the help of a lawyer in Sheridan, reached by wire the week before. A different arrangement, entirely. A shared water agreement, binding and permanent, to be filed with the county recorder, alongside the deed itself, granting fair and equal access to the Freeman Creek for every ranch along the north pasture that had relied on it for a generation, herself retaining the land itself, but never the right to fence the water away from the people who needed it. Doyle read through the summary she handed him, with visibly diminishing patience, his easy manner cooling by the paragraph. "This isn't what the company is prepared to purchase, Miss Freeman. Water rights encumbered this way, the parcel's worth considerably less to us. I'd strongly encourage you to reconsider before this offer is withdrawn permanently." "I understand that," she said. "I'm not asking the company to purchase it under these terms. I'm telling you it's the only terms under which I'll consider selling at all, now or later." Doyle's company, she said, was welcome to make an offer on the land under those terms if it still wished to. It did not wish to. For a moment, something flickered across Doyle's composed face that had nothing to do with business at all. The particular tiredness of a man doing arithmetic on his own, dwindling prospects, a third territory this year, come up empty, a company that would not care why. He gathered his papers with considerably less patience than he'd arrived with, offered a stiff farewell, and left on the next stage out of Buffalo, and Adelaide found she felt nothing at all like loss watching him go, only a kind of settled lightness she hadn't expected, and underneath it, a small, unexpected sympathy for a man who had never once been dishonest about what he wanted, only careless about how he'd gone after getting it. Constance, watching from the parlor doorway, once Doyle's carriage had pulled away, allowed herself a rare open smile. "Your father would have liked that," she said. "The way you just handled that man." It was the first time Constance had offered an opinion about Adelaide's father without being asked, and Adelaide understood it for the gift it was. She brought the new agreement out to the Whitfield ranch herself that same evening, the ink barely dry, and found Eli on the porch, where she'd come to expect him rising, the moment he saw her crossing the yard with something purposeful in her step. She explained it plainly, the way he'd taught her to say true things, without dressing them up in more words than they needed. The water was protected now for his ranch, and every ranch beside his permanently, regardless of anything else that happened between the two of them. She wanted him to hear that first, clearly separate from whatever came next, so there could be no mistaking one thing for the other ever again. He read the document through once slowly, then looked up at her with an expression she hadn't seen on him before, something unguarded, that he usually kept carefully behind the flat calm he showed the world. "You didn't have to do it this way," he said. "Could have sold plain and let the water sort itself out, later courts and all." "I know. Why didn't you?" She had turned this question over more times than she could count in the days leading up to tonight, and found standing on his porch, with the mountains going, that particular purple behind him, that the answer had stopped being complicated somewhere along the way. "Because you never once asked me to," she said. "Not directly, not even when it would have been easy or fair or exactly what anyone in your position had every right to ask for. You let me find the truth on my own time and decide it because it was right, not because you'd pushed me toward it." She held his gaze. "I've spent a long time only trusting things that couldn't change their mind about me. Paper, numbers, contracts. You're the first person who ever made me want to trust something that could." For a moment, he said nothing, and she thought briefly that she'd said too much, laid too much bare on a porch that had held so many careful silences between them, and one very unsteady week besides. Then he set the document down on the porch rail, crossed the short distance between them, and said the thing he'd been holding back since the night she'd stood in his yard, and heard her own name spoken like it mattered more than anything else he might have said instead. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not for the water. Never was about the water, not once, not even at the start. I want you to stay because when you're here, this ranch stops feeling like a place I'm only enduring and starts feeling like a place I actually want to wake up in." He paused, steadying something in his voice that had briefly slipped its careful hold. "I should have said that a month ago. Wasn't brave enough. Wasn't brave enough the night Doyle's story reached you either, if I'm honest, and I mean to spend a good deal longer than one evening making up for that." "You were brave enough today," she said, and closed the last of the distance between them herself. Neither of them said anything more for a long while after that, out on the porch, with the sky doing its slow work of turning from gold to purple to the deep blue of a settled Wyoming night. And when Adelaide finally went inside hours later, it was the Whitfield kitchen table she sat at, the shared water agreement, still lying where they'd left it, forgotten for the better part of the evening, waiting patiently to be signed properly in the morning, by two names instead of one.
These stories were never really about peace, a plan, or a stretch of Rick water. It was about the difference between a man who asks for what benefits him and a man who tells the truth and lets you choose freely anyway. And about a woman brave enough, finally, to trust something that could change its mind about her and choose it regardless. Where are you watching from tonight? Drop your city and stay in the comments. I love seeing how far this story travels. If this one found you at the right moment, hit like and consider subscribing. Until next time, keep writing.